Take a Bible and turn over to Matthew chapter 15. Excuse me, not Matthew 15, Mark 15. That'd be a little bit better. Mark chapter 15. That's going to be kind of the focus of our study this morning. If you've been with us, you know we're looking at kind of the last days of Jesus' life here on this earth, beginning to go through the trials that he had to endure before the cross. A couple weeks ago, we studied about the Jewish trial. Then last week, we paused to look at an event that took place during that Jewish trial, and that was the denial of Peter. And Lord willing, tonight we're going to kind of pause and look at an event that probably took place between the Jewish and the Roman trial of Jesus, and that is the reaction of Judas to Jesus' condemnation. But this morning we're going to focus on kind of the second main trial that Jesus had to go through, and that involves his appearance before a man, as we know in the scripture, as Pontius Pilate. Now, if you look at Mark in verse 1 there of chapter 15, Mark kind of forms a bridge for us between the Jewish trial of Jesus and then him being delivered over into the hands of the Romans. In fact, if you look at verse 1, Mark records this, that straightway in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. A couple things to think about here. It was kind of unusual for Pilate to be in Jerusalem at this time, just kind of a convenient way for them to deliver him immediately over into the hands of Romans. Usually, Pilate would have dwelt in Caesarea, but of course we're studying about, as we have well noted from the scripture, that this is the Passover time for the Jews. And because this is the Passover time, you literally have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jews that have come to the city of Jerusalem. So there's a great influx of people. As you can imagine, usually when there's a great influx of people, there's also problems that arise along with that. And so it was customary for the Roman governor to journey to Jerusalem during this time so that if any problems did arise, that he would be there on the spot and he could deal with them immediately. You know, I was kind of thinking about the idea, you know, what can we liken this to in our society today? And the only thing that I could come up with was the idea of when parents leave their children at home alone. You know, a lot of times, I don't know about you guys, maybe we were just rebellious children, but we acted differently when our parents were at home than we did when our parents were away. You know, our parents could tell us, you do this or you don't do this while I'm gone, and usually we did whatever we wanted. But if they were there, we acted different. And that's kind of the situation here with Pilate. You know, Pilate could have told them during this time, well, do this or don't do this, but just his presence there would have helped deter some of the things that might have happened had he not been there. And so this was just a custom for Pilate to arrive in Jerusalem during this period. Now, he also held court sessions early in the morning during this time. And so Pilate would have been fully prepared for court cases to be brought to him and to deal with, of course, as we're going to study this morning, Jesus accordingly. So a couple of things that I want to kind of focus on this morning. I don't think I'm going to spoil the story for anybody today. We all know that Pilate condemns Jesus to death. But what I want to focus upon is, why did he do that? Why did he make that mistake? And what can we as Christians learn from, you know, when we make mistakes today, following his pattern and really as Christians trying to avoid the same traps that he fell into? So 3 things that I want for us to think about and focus on this morning. 3 mistakes that Pilate made that led to him condemning an innocent man. The first thing that I would point out is, when you read about Pilate, it's pretty obvious the only person that Pilate really cared about was himself. And so when you read this story or this account here in Mark chapter 15, you're going to find that he doesn't really have any concern about the Jews themselves. In fact, if you go with me back there in Mark chapter 1 and you read about the Jews, the chief priests, the elders, bringing Jesus before Pilate, a couple of things that historically might be of benefit to point out. And one of those is this: it was not the custom of Romans to get involved in local politics any more than what was just necessary. A lot of times what you'll find in the Roman Empire is there were places and provinces where they basically just said, okay, you guys do your own thing, but if you get out of whack, we're going to be down here and we're going to straighten it out. And sometimes they would appoint their own people into certain offices, kind of help control certain things. But for a large part, they let a lot of these local authorities kind of function on their own. And so when you look at the Jews, did the Jews have any authority? Yeah, they had some. Did they have complete authority? No, they did not. They did have authority, as we're reading about here in the trial of Jesus. They did have the authority to question people. They did have an authority to kind of run this preliminary exam of people before they're actually put into the Roman court system. They did have the power to kind of pronounce their own sentence upon these people. But as you read through the story, there's one thing that's pretty obvious about the Jews and their authorities at this level. One power that they did not have was to condemn people to death. Okay, well, I guess they could condemn them, but they didn't actually have the power to put them to death themselves. They could bring them to the Romans and they could say, we put this guy on trial and we found that he's worthy of death and now we're going to deliver him into your hands. If they'd had that power or authority, they would have killed Jesus right there on the spot. But they didn't. And so they had to bring him and deliver him into the hands of the Roman government. Now, again, a couple of things to kind of think about here. You know, the legal system of Rome is probably like about any legal system that exists today. I'm not saying our legal system in America is a bad thing, but are there some flaws in it? Sure. Do you sometimes get bad people in high places that leads to bad decisions? Yes, you do, don't you? Roman government was no different either. And a lot of times what happened within the legal process of the Roman government is if you had somebody who was very wealthy or you had somebody who was very powerful, they could bring other people into the court system and basically the judge would rule in their favor because they were wealthy and powerful. Well, do you see that in our society any today? Yeah, you do, don't you? Some of the same things that happen in our society can happen or happen within the Jewish and the Roman society too. And so what you have is you have very powerful people, Jewish leaders, people with a lot of money, people with a lot of influence who are basically bringing a nobody, talking about Christ here, in appearance before Roman court. Was he kind of doomed from the start? Yeah. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot that he could do or say that was going to get him out of the predicament that he was in. We talked a little bit about that last week too. But here's what I do want to point out. That didn't necessarily mean that Pilate loved the Jewish nation. Now, he respected wealth, he respected power, but just because a person was a Jew didn't mean that Pilate loved you and was going to give you special favor. And so you have this group of Jews who are bringing Jesus before Pilate. In fact, here's how John records it in John 18 and beginning about verse 29. Pilate then went out unto them and said, what accusation bring ye against this man? And they answered and said unto him, if he were not, the King James Version says a malefactor, it's basically saying he's a criminal. You know, if he were not a criminal, we would not have delivered him up to thee. And then Pilate said unto them, take ye and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, it is not lawful for us to put a man to death. So what we learn through this process is, first of all, did Pilate really care about the Jews and their religion? No, he didn't care one bit about it, did he? In fact, they bring Christ to him and he says, okay, what are the charges? And they said, well, he's a criminal. You know, that's kind of vague, isn't it? Be like us today, you know, you bring somebody to court and you say, well, what's the charges against him? He broke the law. Okay, well, which law did he break? You know, what is he guilty of? And immediately Pilate recognizes, oh, you guys are talking about your law, right? You're talking about your religion and your religious laws. And he says, listen, if this guy's a criminal, if you got a charge, tell me the charge. If you don't, you guys take him and deal with him according to your laws. The problem was this: the Jews says our laws say he has to die. Our laws say he has to be killed, but we don't have that power and we don't have that authority. And so that's why we brought him in and delivered him into your hands. But basically, Pilate, when you talk about a Roman citizen coming, or a non-Roman citizen coming before a Roman governor, those guys could probably do whatever they wanted and get away with it. But they weren't real crazy about putting a man to death because Jewish religious law had been violated. And so that's kind of what Pilate's saying here. Now, there are other examples of this in the New Testament. If you were to look at Acts chapter 18, verses 12 through 16, Paul gets into one of these predicaments too. When he goes into the region of Achaia, remember that the Jews bring him before the court system and they say, this guy's, he's leading an insurrection is how they describe it there, a rebellion. And immediately the Bible says, the governor of Achaia says, get this trash out of my courtroom. He said, you're talking about your religion. You're talking about, you want to charge him with something about your names and your Jewish religion, something about your laws. I don't have time for it. Get it out of the Roman court system. And you know what the Jews did? They kind of took matters into their own hand, beat up on a few guys, and the Bible says the Roman government was all right with that. He didn't have any problem with them doing that. He just didn't want it in his court system, didn't want to deal with it. That's Pilate. Pilate says, get this trash out of here. This is about your religion and your laws. There's nothing that I'm going to have to do with it. And they say, no, it's about the death penalty. And so now you have this idea of what can we do according to Roman law to show this guy is worthy of death. Because under the Jewish law, remember the conviction or the charge was blasphemy. He blasphemed God. And so he was worthy of death according to the law. And Pilate's question kind of, reflects that when you read here in Mark chapter 15. What could they charge him with that was going to bring concern to the Roman government? Well, we'll read about that here in just a moment. But initially, understand this. Did he care about the Jews? Did he care about their religion? No, not one bit. The second thing that you'll see about Pilate here that really shows his selfishness is he didn't care about the fact that Jesus was an innocent man. Okay, now I know a lot of people sometimes when you read the account of Pilate, they say, well, he's a good guy. Because he said Jesus was innocent. Yeah, he said he was innocent, but what did he do about it? The bottom line is this, he had him put to death. He sentenced him to death even though he knew he was an innocent man. And if you notice, as Pilate begins questioning him in Mark chapter 15 and verse 2, he asked him the question, he says, are you the king of the Jews? You can kind of see the way that the charges are going against him here. I think basically the Jews have come up and say this guy is leading a rebellion. He claims to be a king, he claims to have citizens, and he's established a kingdom. We know the only king should be Caesar, right? We know the only government that has any power and control is Rome, and so he's rebelling against Rome and its government. So the first question that Pilate asked him is, are you a king? Jesus just simply says unto him, thou sayest. Remember the reaction that Jesus gave before the high priest when he questions him, are you the Son of God? He said, well, you said it with your own mouth. And he kind of does the same thing with Pilate here, right? Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? That's what you say. Right? That's the accusation that's being brought against me here. And then in verse 3, it says the chief priests accused him of many things. A lot of other things that they accused him of, but Jesus answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against thee. But Jesus yet answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. The Jewish council presents him as a criminal when they bring him before Pilate. He's guilty of a capital crime. He's this dangerous, revolutionist that is leading this insurrection against the Roman government. Well, Jesus had the opportunity. Anytime a person is accused of a crime, they had an opportunity to defend themselves. And so as he stands before Pilate, the first thing that Jesus does is he answers very vaguely, right? He says, you told me that I'm the king of the Jews here. But he also chooses not to say anything after that. And so accusation after accusations being labeled against Christ, how does he respond? He does. He's basically saying, I'm going to let the truth speak for itself. You know, I'm going to let the truth speak for me. I don't need to tell you what the answer to all these questions are. Here's the problem if you're a Roman governor. Christ has not denied the charges. Okay? So he's being charged with insurrection against Rome. What happens if you, as a Roman governor, have examined him? He didn't really deny the charges and you just let him go. Probably not a good look, right? Probably not going to be received favorably by the Roman government. But here's what happens. The Jews try to wear down Pilate's resistance. And here's what Pilate knew about the whole situation, as Mark records in verse 10 here of chapter 15. Mark says, "For he," that is Pilate, "knew that the chief priest had delivered him for envy." Listen, Pilate had no great love for the Jews. He wasn't just out here to do favors because he loved the Jews and he loved their religion and everything about them. That's not what Pilate's condemnation of Christ was about. Mark says he knew that the leaders were not interested in justice. That's not why they had brought Jesus here, because he was really a criminal and he violated some law. He knew the only thing that they were looking for was vengeance. They were out to kill Jesus because they were jealous of him. And John gives us the most details of this Roman trial. You combine that with the gospel records. Here's what you'll find. Pilate repeatedly talked to Jesus, and he repeatedly found no fault. He repeatedly says, "This is an innocent man." Why did he put him to death then? He put him to death because it was in his own best interest, didn't it? Didn't have anything to do with who Jesus was. Didn't have anything to do with the fact that he was innocent or guilty. It was what was in his own best interest. And so if Pilate didn't care about the Jews, and if Pilate didn't care about Jesus, the question is, who did he care about? The answer is himself. Pilate was a very selfish individual. That led to him making some very poor choices, didn't it? Well, lesson's pretty obvious for us today too, right? If we don't care about others, if we don't care about innocence and guilt, we're going to make some pretty poor choices in life too. We're going to do some pretty awful things to some good people. Pilate found himself in that predicament. Let's talk about the second thing that went wrong or led to Pilate making poor choices. The second thing is this: Pilate let the populace, the mass of people, help determine what his decisions were going to be. Well, I mean, you could make a whole sermon in and of itself on that particular point. But let me just point out, because Pilate let the masses of the Jews influence his decision, here's some poor choices that he made. First of all, he released the person who was guilty. When you really read the story about Christ and his Roman trial in Mark chapter 15 and verse 6, here's what Mark reveals to us. History doesn't tell us this, but Bible history does. It says, at the feast, the Passover, that's what we're talking about here, he, that is Pilate, released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them, that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. Now here's what we learn about Pilate. Again, Pilate was a guy, he didn't care about the Jews, didn't care about the Jewish religion, he cared about himself. And so one thing the Bible says that he did in order to kind of keep the people pacified and to kind of help them look at him as a good guy is at the Passover, one guy who had been put into prison, he would release to them every year. And so the Bible says the Jews start to cry out to him, hey, give us this favor. You know, you do this every year. Now is the time. We want one of our prisoners released unto us. So Pilate immediately thinks, I've got a way of escape. Okay, so what I can do is, here's this prisoner Jesus, right? I can release him to them. I've done what they wanted me to do. I've showed them favor, and so now things are probably going to be okay. But he knows this. They're not just going to immediately agree to release Jesus, right? So I got to give them a choice where basically they have no choice. I got to put something on the table here that's so ridiculous that the only thing that they're going to choose is to release Jesus or Christ. So what does he do? Well, here's what he does in verse 9. Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priest had delivered him for envy. But the chief priest moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. So he says, here's your choice. Here's what I'm going to do. Got two guys here that are prisoners. I can either release Jesus to you or I can release Barabbas. What do we know about Barabbas? We know he was not a very good guy, right? In fact, some people, it talks about him leading this rebellion. Now, let me point out, some commentators say this was a rebellion against Rome. There is no Roman governor in his right mind who would release a prisoner who had led a rebellion against Rome. I think he had led a rebellion against the Jews themselves. He had rebelled against them. In the process, the Bible said he had killed a man. He'd murdered a man. Not only that, but John tells us in John 18 and verse 40, this isn't the extent of the crimes of Barabbas. He was also a very well-known thief. So you have this guy who's rebelled against your society and your hierarchy. In the process, he committed murder. He'd also been stealing from you. Pilate says, they'll never want this guy. They'll never agree to his release. And so which one of these prisoners do you want me to release unto you? Now, if I were to ask us, I think we're probably, most of us, I don't know anybody who's not in their right mind this morning. But if I were to give you the choice between releasing from prison a guy who had committed murder, a guy who rebelled against the United States of America, and a guy who was knowingly stole from time to time from us versus a guy who was an innocent man, which one would you choose? Not a hard choice, is it? But the Bible tells us that the Jews were so adamant that the chief priests, that the leaders of the Jews literally walked through the crowd and they're encouraging the mass of the people, say Barabbas. They tell him we want Barabbas, we don't want Christ. And so that's what happens in this story. Pilate is perplexed by their choice. He doesn't understand how they're willing to let a dangerous thief and a murderer loose rather than an innocent man. But he's also not going to go against the flow. He's also not going to cause any wave because this is what the populace wants. This is what the mass wants. And so he made some bad choices in this process. He chose to release a guilty prisoner, a guilty person into their society. And the third thing, to kill an innocent one. In fact, if you notice in verse 12 there, Pilate answers and says unto them again, What will ye then that I should do unto him who ye called the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, Crucify. Pilate said unto them, Why? What evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, Crucify him. Notice verse 15. Here's the key to understanding this trial. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them and delivered Jesus, and when he had scourged him, to be crucified. A couple of things. First of all, even though Pilate agreed to release Barabbas, who we obviously know was guilty, that didn't mean that Jesus was guilty, just because he released this prisoner. And note the moral weakness again of Pilate. He knew that Jesus was innocent, right? There was no doubt in his mind. He knew that the Jews wanted to kill him because they were jealous of him. What should he have done based upon that and based upon justice? He should have immediately released him. Should have turned him free. But instead of standing up for the truth and what was right, Pilate gave in to the cries of the masses. Mark doesn't give us any insight into Pilate's mind, except the only thing that was going on in the mind of Pilate is he wanted to satisfy the crowd. He wanted the favor of the populace. And so that led to him not being strong enough to do what he knew to be right. His problem was he lacked the courage to stand up for what was right. And in deciding what he was going to do, he didn't ask this question. He didn't ask, is this what's right? Here's what he asked. Is this what's best for me? And is this what is going to make me the most popular in the eyes of the people? Man, I'm glad we don't do that as Christians today, aren't you? Glad we don't have that problem. Aren't we almost, as Americans, a lot of times, just like Pilate? Our question is not, is this right? Should I stand up for what's right? Our question is often, what's in my best interest? What's going to help me out the most? What's going to give me the most favor with all the population or the people today? And Pilate answered that question. He said, well, that's what I'm going to do. We need to be different as Christians. The third thing that I'll mention real quickly here, I actually started late this morning. I'm not preaching a long time if you think I am, but I can quit early and make up for some of the other times. Pilate tolerated the mistreatment of other people, and specifically Jesus. Now, a couple of things in this story that stand out to me about what they did with Christ after he was condemned. And Pilate could have stopped all that. He didn't have to let the people do what they did to Jesus. He just allowed it because that's what they wanted to do, and he wanted to be popular with the people. He wanted to do what was in his best interest. And so what do we read about? Well, in Mark 15, I'm not going to read the whole passage, but if you read verses 15 through 20, he's scourged, he's whipped, he's tied to a pole, and he's beaten. That was kind of normal procedure for a person who was going to be crucified. But after he had went through the normal procedure, the Bible says that the soldiers began to do some extra things to him. You read in verse 17, they clothed him with purple. Why would they put purple on him? They removed his own clothing. They put purple clothing on him. That was the color of royalty. If you wore purple out in the eyes of the public, that was a sign to them that you were of royal descent. And so they decided, let's have a little bit of fun here. Let's have a little bit of fun at Jesus' expense. We're going to dress him up like royalty, and we're going to make a crown for him, right? But our crown's going to be made out of thorns. And we're going to anoint him. You always have to anoint royalty, but we're going to anoint him with spit. We're not going to anoint him with oil. And then we're going to put a reed in his hand. All the royalty carried around this powerful symbol of their staff. We'll give him a powerful staff. It'll be a little droopy reed that he can hold in his hand. We'll have some fun with it and smack him around a little bit with it too. Pilate didn't have to let those things go on. He had the power and he had the authority to pull the plug and to say, you know what? We've already done what we're supposed to do. That's it. That's the end of it. But he allowed other people to mistreat Jesus. And what we read about, now, let me again emphasize this. There's no indication to me that Pilate himself took part in what they did. But there's no indication either that he tried to stop. All indications are he just simply allowed it to happen. And here's what ends up happening in the end of this story. You remember we read about or mentioned that they put that purple clothing on him to help make fun of him. So they're getting ready to put Jesus to death. And they decide this in verse 20, we need to get those clothes back. You imagine that? The Bible says they took the purple off of him, and then they put his own clothes back on him, and they led him to be crucified. Now, a couple of things that pop into my mind. First of all, I don't know what the condition of that purple clothing was. I doubt it was that valuable anyway. Now, I doubt they're going to take the most valuable purple clothing that they have and put it on a prisoner who they know they've beaten him. It's going to get blood all over it. And I imagine it was probably this old worn out piece of cloth. And so what did you have? You had this old worn out faded robe that they put on Christ. And what everybody said was this, or the soldiers said was this, that's valuable. We can't let him go to death with that on. We can't send him to the cross and let him be buried in that. We need to get that back. And the irony of that story is they placed more value on this old worn out robe than they did on the life of an innocent man. No concern over the value of the life of Jesus. But yet they valued his clothes. Man, you think about the world today. Does the world today value possessions over people? I would say probably a lot of, not everybody, but there's probably a lot of them that do. I can recall as children growing up, for us, Mom and Dad didn't have a lot of money. When you bought or got name brand something, you were always super proud of that. And I can remember the first pair of Nike shoes that Mom and Dad bought for me and getting to wear those. And then it wasn't a day or two after Mom and Dad had bought those shoes for me that a story came out in the public about a young man who had been murdered for his shoes. For his shoes. Do people value possessions over people today? Sure. People are killed today for their shoes. They're killed today for their name brand clothing. They're killed today for money. Not anything indifferent. But as Christians, we should not allow that kind of mistreatment to take place. We certainly shouldn't be a part of it. But we certainly shouldn't allow it to take place within our society if we have the power to stop it. We learned some valuable lessons from Pilate's failures. 3 things that we looked about today. First of all, we need to be mindful. We need to care for others, not just for ourselves. We need to care for those who are outside our own race. We need to care for those who are outside our own nation. We need to care for those who are outside our own religion. That's a good lesson in and of itself, too. But we need to care for other people, especially those who are innocent, those who are weak. The second thing, don't let the masses determine the choices you're going to make in this life. The Bible teaches anything about what the population is going to choose, it's usually a bad choice. I don't know of any story in the Bible. There may be one that doesn't pop into our head, but I don't know of any story in the Bible where the mass majority of people made the good choice. I know of a lot of stories where the mass or the majority of the people made the bad choice. And so just to understand that it's unreliable to let the masses make our choices for us. We need to, if we do that, we're going to be guilty of making bad choices. We're going to be guilty of some of the things. We're going to free the guilty and punish the innocent, just like Pilate. The third thing, don't tolerate or don't join in the mistreatment of other people. Jesus was mocked. He was made fun of. He was hurt. He was disgraced by these other people. That has no place in the life of a Christian. And if we have the power to intervene and to stop those things, we need to make sure that, or the right or the privilege, we need to make sure that we're taking advantage of that. And certainly the last one, we've got to learn to value people more than we do possessions. We can learn a lot from Pilate and the trial of Jesus here. Maybe there's one